Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com.
So greetings and welcome, Rory. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Now, before we go into the meat of our conversation, I do like to ask all of my guests something about their origin story. So it would be good to know from in your own words what you studied at university. Was it inevitable you'd end up focusing on commodity markets in the financial sector, and some of the key sort of career milestones that you've had up until now?
Yeah, so I had a very circuitous and I would say non-standard path into the industry. My background is I started as a philosophy major in undergrad, and I went into political science and kind of international relations and security studies. So I was very focused on war and peace and kind of geopolitics. And I wrote most of my papers in undergrad on the Korean War. Like I was very kind of big, kind of traditional war and peace studies stuff. And I kind of got interested in commodities broadly and oil specifically. I think where my story is kind of cliche is I read Dan Yergin's The Prize. And I think as every analyst did at some point in their career, and I got really, really hooked up on the security angle, this idea of Winston Churchill changing over the Royal Navy from Welsh coal to Persian or now Iranian crude. And I think that, that was very interesting to me. It provided, substantial tactical benefits, but at this kind of cost of supply chains and security. So that's kind of how I got into this. And I went through grad school at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. And halfway through that, I had planned to go into security and counterterrorism work in Ottawa. And I kind of caught the markets bug, and I interned in DC. I basically started drinking from the fire hose. Like I had to do organic chemistry to understand what the heck is happening in a refinery. I had to do finance to figure out what the heck a futures curve is. And rather than working in security, my first job was working in the economics department at Scotiabank in Toronto. So I did that for a while, for 6 years. And then I left at the beginning of 2020 because we were starting a family and I was traveling a lot. And I was started working for the family office, And then COVID hit. Oil markets became extremely interesting. I started writing just for my own kind of satisfaction on the side, and that took off. And I was thankfully able at the beginning of 2022 to turn on a paywall, and that I left the family office work as full-time, and now I'm full-time on commodity context. So I really enjoy, I covered all commodities at Scotiabank, but now I focus primarily on crude oil and refined products. And it's been a wild ride. So I'm very, very grateful that subscribers have facilitated my ability to kind of nerd out to this professionally. So I thank them, and I thank everyone else.
That's a great story, and I'm a big fan of your newsletter as well. And I'll include a link at the end in the show notes as well. Now in terms of oil markets, when we came into this year, I mean, what would you say were the main expectations of players in the oil market?
Yeah, so coming into this year, it was still very much a question of, can OPEC's plan for 2023 still work? At the beginning of 2020, and I think just rewinding just a little bit, the OPEC Plus's latest cutting cycle, I'll just say OPEC for the rest of this because Plus is onerous. At the end of 2022, they began this new cutting cycle in October, cutting 2 million barrels a day on paper. And that was initially to kind of support prices. And I think there's been a lot of debate recently about, like, did they have a triple-digit price target? And well, OPEC and OPEC Plus in Saudi Arabia officially has no price target. I think a lot of the blowback on that story is kind of unjustified because obviously they were aiming for high 90s, low triple digits, because when they started cutting again at the end of 2022, prices were above $90 a barrel Brent. So I think that's a revealed preference for me, and I think that's how I've tracked OPEC since. So I think the initial thought was we're going to support markets briefly, temporarily. There's a lot of temporary language in 2023. That didn't work. Then they did the additional cut in April. That didn't work. Then we had Saudi Arabia's lollipop cut, which was the first time they had really unilaterally cut production in decades. And I think went back against a very long history of Saudi kind of oil policy dating back to the 80s around kind of, multilateral kind of oil policy. So I think they had this feeling that if we just do one more cut, one more support, eventually the market's going to right itself. Demand's going to reaccelerate. U.S. shale is going to slow down. And you saw a lot of the same talking points out of OPEC and out of the Saudi minister. They're like, oh, well, 2023 was a flash in the pan because privates were monetizing or trying to monetize their inventories to get sold in PE deals, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that was this kind of feeling that they kept trying to do one more piece, one more support. And heading into this year was the feeling like, this is going to be it. we're going to do one last cut. They agreed to another cut at the end of 2023 to take effect in the beginning of this year. And then everything just went completely sideways for them. I think, from the kind of geopolitical roller coaster to the fact that U.S. shale has slowed, but not nearly as quickly as anyone had hoped. You would see non-OPEC production elsewhere, Canada, where I am in Toronto, Guyana, Brazil, all benefiting from these higher, effectively OPEC subsidized prices. And at the same time, demand in the world was kind of fine and tepid. But then China, which was a massive contributor in 2023, the largest demand growth in history, China alone, increased global demand by like 90% of the marginal gain for that year. This year, it turned completely in reverse and is actually not only flatlined, but begun to actually contract in year-over-year terms for the second time ever in 30 plus years. So that was this kind of conundrum OPEC found itself in. And now it's been trying to kind of bit on this back foot, trying to manage narrative, trying to figure out how we can return these barrels before the entire kind of house of cards falls in on itself.
And so in terms of market balance, in terms of, oversupply, undersupply, how would you characterize the market right now? I mean, leaving aside political issues, which have come to the fore recently, but just in terms of fundamentals, where are we in terms of supply versus demand?
My models, and I think most other people in the market, are showing still an undersupplied market writ large. I think you see this in futures curves. You see backwardation continuing to persist, even in the kind of more physical, kind of connected contracts like Brent DFLs. That should be at least slightly more resistant to kind of speculative pressures. So I think the market remains kind of undersupplied in current spot markets, and inventories remain relatively low, whether or not you're looking at the US, whether or not you're looking at OECD broadly. So I think that what's interesting about the current market, and I always try and split kind of the price we're seeing into three big pieces. You have current fundamentals, which I basically boil down to inventory position, the least kind of manipulable theories you have. Then you have anticipated fundamentals, because theoretically, at least, these markets are forward-looking. And then you have kind of realized kind of speculative pressure in these markets. So I would say fundamentals right now, currently, probably point to Brent prices in the around 80 Brent, low 80s Brent. But I think everyone in the market, because OPEC keeps saying it's going to return these latest 2.2 million barrel tranche to the market over the course of 2025, everyone's models, myself included, show that resulting in a fairly acute oversupply for the balance of the year. So I think when OPEC keeps saying this and the market starts believing them, this is to be expected that we're having, $5, $10 a barrel even kind of discount on current fundamentals as the market tries to get ahead of that. The challenge, however, I think, is how that's manifesting, because then we move to the speculative question. I think we're getting into the kind of roller coaster of geopolitics and everything else, but I think there's no doubt that the discretionary element within kind of the speculative or managed money component of the Commitments for Traders report, and you guys actually do great work on the COT report generally, that they're overwhelmingly bearish, and I think reasonably so, because looking forward, it looks really terrible. The challenge with that is that historically, managed money, particularly discretionary traders, are really, really good contra indicators of where price pressure is going to go. So if we don't see those kind of deficit or those surpluses realized next year, then that all unwinds and turns into kind of tailwinds for the market, buying pressure as they kind of rebuild and wind down those shorts and rebuild that length. And I think the fundamental challenge with that is that next year's balances remain fundamentally a discretionary policy choice of OPEC Plus and specifically Saudi Arabia. So you need to have a coherent theory of why, after 2+ years of vehemently defending higher prices, the Saudis are finally going to throw in the towel and say, okay, let's have it. We're going down to 60, we're going down to 50, which is kind of what I think these balances imply if they happen kind of without any adjustment in course.
Okay. Sometimes the rationale people give for Saudi wanting to oversupply the market and reduce oil prices is to wipe out competitors.
Yep.
Do you think that's a justifiable reason, a valid reason for next year? Because obviously recently, as you pointed out, the narrative has been they want higher oil prices, and now if there's a pivot, could that justify the pivot?
I think absolutely it could justify it. I think you just have to recognize, and I think kind of explicitly say that it is in fact a pivot, because I think a lot of people just kind of toss this aside. Because I think I did a lot of work on, I did my, did a lot of work prior to COVID in 2020 on OPEC policy and on a history of Saudi policy. And what you had seen historically was that the Saudis were generally the price dove within OPEC. They were the conciliators. They wanted to make the US happy. They wanted to support the global economy. They did this long game, unlike some shorter sighted members like Libya or Iraq that had much more acute budgetary pressures. The Saudis could kind of say, we're taking a long view. We have the bond market. There's no immediate concern for like fiscal viability of the kingdom. So I think what was interesting was that, one, you have to acknowledge that October 2022, and then particularly July 2023, when you had that lollipop cut, was itself a major and historic break from the kingdom's kind of more small c conservative oil policy. And I think that when you have such a big change, I think on one level you can say, well, and I said at the time, this is fundamentally looks unsustainable and concerning because they're setting up the mother of all kind of bear risks in the market when you have upwards of 4 to 6 million barrels a day, depending on how you're counting, of OPEC crude withheld off the market. Even if you have, cohesion, the group break down, well, all of a sudden, that's not just like 50, we're back down to $20 really, really quickly if that thing falls apart. So I thought that was unsustainable in itself. But I think what we've seen time and time again is that every time that the Saudis and the rest of OPEC have had a chance to wind back that support, they've deferred at the last moment. I think we had initially seen this when they were supposed to begin raising production along with this current cut easing plan in October. And then, well, look, we were down in, the high 60s, low 70s Brent, and all of a sudden, market conditions no longer justify that move. So I think you have to still have this idea of what a Saudi price target, or at least an acceptable kind of OPEC plus price is in your model, because I just don't see any scenario where they go through 2.2 million barrels a day of easing as we're like crashing through the floor of 60. That just doesn't check for me with any of recent kind of, and call it like a recency bias, sure. But I think we have to be very conscious of the way that they have been trying to aggressively and bullishly manage the market for the past 2 years.
And I guess you're right then, the proof's in the pudding. We have to actually see them follow through on these sort of speculation rather than actually just say they are going to, pivot. Now, within OPEC Plus, who are the players outside of Saudi that we need to keep an eye on? You mentioned, Libya and Iraq historically being ones that are a bit more harder to sort of predict and less cohesive. But who do you focus on outside of Saudi within OPEC Plus?
Yeah, so I think, the big three that I think everyone's focusing on right now, and I think particularly the OPEC Secretariat, are these three kind of cheating states. You've got Iraq, you've got Russia, and you've got Kazakhstan. Really, all of those, they have been officially overproducing their quotas. And for the first time, at least as far as I'm aware, in the industry, in OPEC's history, they've come up with this idea of like these compensation cuts. And I think the other thing that's bizarre about OPEC right now, and I think has to kind of color your analysis, is that it's become an extraordinarily ad hoc organization. It's kind of more political cat wrangling than it is the kind of dispassionate technocratic market manager of yesteryear. And I think when you're looking at these kind of compensation cuts, again, is it real? Is it kind of a figment of trying to keep everyone else on side? It's really hard to tell because everyone's optimistic that Iraq is finally getting its act together. And I think there was a lot of fanfare made in this latest data that they had a decent size, kind of 130, 150, depending on how you're counting, 1,000 barrel a day reduction month on month in September production. But that still put them more than 100,000 barrels a day above their quota, even not counting the compensation pledges, which added almost another 100,000 barrels a day of overproduction. So I think we're moving in the right direction. And I think you have seen promising moves on things like Iraqi Kurdistan, which has been a major factor in this because Baghdad has said it can't control KRG production. And that's been messing with the numbers. There's been a very notable split between the secondary source estimates in OPEC's monthly oil market report that the market, and myself included, treats as like the official numbers. But then on their direct communication,
what are the numbers for Iraq in terms of production, like daily production? What's the magnitudes we're talking about overall?
Yeah, so let me actually just pull up. I just had this working last night. But you're looking at basically about, I think it's 4.1 million barrels a day. Yeah, 4.1 million barrels a day for Iraq right now. But it's official. It's production that's directly reported to the Secretariat by Baghdad is something like 200,000 barrels a day lower than that. And typically what you've seen is that split is roughly what people think KRG is producing, because that split emerged after this Kurdish to Turkey pipeline went down at the beginning of 2023 because of an international arbitration dispute. And because that could no longer go through Baghdad's kind of centrally cleared marketing arm, they lost visibility on it. And for a while, there was this assumption that they weren't producing really anything. But then there was a lot of reporting. Argus has done fantastic reporting on this, on kind of essentially how the KRG continued to produce and actually effectively refined it domestically, smuggled it on trucks. They were getting terrible prices for it, but it was still affecting global balances. So I think that was this big issue. And I think now that you're starting to see that resolved, and apparently Baghdad and Erbil have come to some kind of agreement, if that's true, that's promising. And I think, puts us on the right path to better compliance and reduces the risk, all else equal, of the mother of all bearish scenarios, which is this entire thing collapsing. Because when people say like, oh, Saudi Arabia is pushing back on Baghdad, sure, there are diplomatic soft levers, there's investment or whatever, but there's really only one hard lever OPEC has to deal with cheating, and that's overproducing by the core producers, which is Saudi et al., to punish those cheaters. And that is really difficult in the current environment because that's the exact bearish risk they're trying to avoid. So I think even this constant kind of media chatter of they're going to flood the market, and then Riyadh's like, no, we're not. But then we're also overwhelmingly focused on compliance. That's our most important thing. And if they're not compliant, we have to flood the market. It's a very weird narrative strategy. And I think it's just, reasonably confused. It's confusing me. It's confusing the market for sure. And I think that's the challenge right now is you're trying to pursue a bunch of implicit policy priorities with OPEC Plus, cohesion, group politics, et cetera, as well as market management. And it's really, really difficult to do all of those things at the same time while also having a clear-eyed kind of message to the market. But I think beyond Iraq, Russia and Kazakhstan, I think less of a concern generally. They're also, I think, Saudi Arabia in particular holds, I think, OPEC Plus or the non-core OPEC members to slightly lower standard anyways. But I think the other one that I think is the one to watch for obvious reasons is the United Arab Emirates. And both that there's a lot of debate as to how much they're actually producing, whether or not they're producing potentially materially more than is reflected in the secondary source estimates based on exports, which is kind of this unspoken rumor in the market that some people include in their balances and some people don't. But obviously including higher UAE production makes balances look weaker, and to a degree makes some of these prices and weakness in the markets make a little bit more sense. But also you've seen that they're the primary member within OPEC Plus and OPEC in particular that has been pressing for less market support, more market share, more production. They secured an increase to their baseline at the beginning of 2023, and then again at the beginning of 2024. And that seems to be, that's not being delayed. That's going ahead regardless. So they've invested huge amounts of money to increase production capacity. And at this stage, they're like, we've held off producing it long enough. They are, by some counts, before all these baseline adjustments, they were withholding roughly the same amount of crude off the market officially as Saudi Arabia was, with a much, much smaller production base. So they're proportionally at one point were the largest contributor to OPEC. And I think they kind of thought that remains unfair. So when a lot of other countries saw their baselines reduced, like Nigeria, like Angola before it left, like Azerbaijan, like Malaysia, because capacity had reduced, the UAE, I think, rightfully was like, why aren't we getting an upgrade? We've clearly increased our capacity.
Okay, yeah, understood. Okay, so that's the OPEC side of things. How about the non-OPEC side of things? You mentioned Guyana, which not many people, non-oil specialists would talk about. You mentioned, obviously, there's US, Brazil as well. But perhaps we can start with Guyana, because you mentioned that. I've heard the oil specialists mentioned them as well.
Yeah, so I mean, Guyana is a fascinating story because even like a decade ago, they were producing zero oil, like zero. And by the end of this decade, they will be the largest per capita producer in the world, outpacing Qatar and Kuwait and all of the kind of, Gulf monarchies that have kind of traditionally held that title. It's been it's been arguably the most successful offshore exploration cycle in the history of the industry, led primarily by ExxonMobil and its partners in the Strohbrook Block, which is offshore, deep offshore. And you had these, it's been this kind of new phase. I mean, I remember a decade ago covering the offshore space and talking about how it didn't look great. The outlook looks terrible. High cost, kind of complicated projects. There were like, the classic stories of like people like helicoptering at a bolt to a platform, like really structural costly. Like you were seeing $80, $100 break evens talked about in like the early 2010s, like oil sands stuff, right? And I'll get to oil sands in a second because I am Canadian, so I have to plug. But the big change has been this shift to these FPSOs of these basically floating production platforms that you have these base construction on the seafloor, and then tubes and pipes that basically connect up to these ships that have dramatically reduced the cost of production and increased the kind of modular expansion of the industry. So you're seeing right now Guyana, depending on the year, adding 100 to 200,000 barrels a day each and every year. And by the end of the decade, they're probably going to be producing, over 1 million barrels a day. And again, from nothing a decade ago. So that's a huge, huge development in the industry. And it's also because we're talking structural costs in the kind of $35 to $40 a barrel range. This is very competitive. It's also some of the lowest emissions intensity, oil in the world. And it also happens to be a medium crude, which is also just very in demand right now with the kind of balance of, crude qualities. We can talk about that a bit later. But it's been a huge success. And I think something that OPEC also can't do much about, because this is, like there's a plan in place for the next 6, 7, 8 years of Exxon in particular, bringing new platforms online that are mostly price agnostic. And again, you would have to really, really crater prices for a long time to change the goal. Similar to kind of what we're seeing in Brazil. Brazil, obviously a much more mature basin. You have Petrobras as a kind of state actor that kind of complicates matters to a degree. But you're also seeing, depending on the year, kind of 150 to 300,000 barrels a day of supply growth in Brazil as well. So let's just take let's even take the midpoint of this. Let's say we're doing 150 in Guyana a year. We're doing, let's say, 200 in Brazil. So that's 350. Then you're having Canada, which after a period of kind of a pause, and now we have Canada's recently started up the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline to the West Coast out of British Columbia. That's added 590,000 barrels of new pipeline capacity to the industry, which has been essentially acutely pipeline constrained for the entirety of my career. This is the most headroom we've had in egress since I started working in this industry.
And that pipeline is ready now. It's ready.
Yep, we are shipping out. We started shipping out as of mid-May, early June, and that's largely right now going. Predominantly has gone to Pad 5 in the U.S., so California, mostly L.A. refineries, but increasingly has opened markets and bilateral kind of contacts in China, India, South Korea, Japan, which is huge for Canada because historically Canada has exported 98+% of its crude to U.S. refineries. The concentration even goes further. It's something like 10 large refineries in the United States consume more than half of Canadian exports, which is a staggering level of concentration. I don't think you see anywhere else in the world or in the market. Most major producers have seaborne access. They flexibly switch, customers all the time. That's part of the fun of crude trading. I've had people tell me that like Canadian crude traders barely trade crude. Like they're basically just like putting it into different places in the Midwest largely. But I had a driller that basically told me that basically give me a pipe and I'll fill it. So Canada this year, a couple months ago was growing at a pace of 400,000 barrels a day year over year. Probably overall for this year is kind of going to probably do 200 plus. So you've got, let's say, 350 from Guyana and Brazil, another 200 from Canada. You're already over half a million before we even talk about the United States. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say the US story, it's been a shale gas story, boom bust. They seem to have recovered of late. So go on to sort of tell us about the shale gas or the US oil story more generally.
Yeah, and I think so. The challenge with U.S. oil production is that it's outperformed expectations every year since I've been in this market. Last year, as an example, in 2023, which again, this is two major things spoiled OPEC's party in 2023, was the unexpected resurgence of Iranian crude, probably 700,000 barrels a day there, and the fact that the United States crude production, or total liquids, which includes natural gas liquids, jumped from an initial expectation at the beginning of the year from around 700 and 800,000 barrels a day of growth to more than 1.5 or 1.6 million. So they doubled growth expectations in 2023, which is obviously
a increase. I mean,
it's a huge increase. It's a huge increase.
How did that happen? I mean,
So this is the classic thing. So I think when you look at the historical relationship between the kind of leading indicators in the industry, the one that's most commonly used is the Baker Hughes, oil directed rig count, right? This is something that like rigs, just for those who aren't as familiar, rigs drill wells, fracking spreads complete wells is the kind of split. We can talk about both of them to a degree, but what you've seen is crude oil directed rigs in the United States actually peaked at the end of 2022. When prices were higher. So they started declining then, and they declined straight through 2023. So everyone was looking at this, including the EIA's own models. And I think arguably they have the best overall kind of at least consistent model on US production. They looked at that and they said, wow, we're absolutely going lower. There's no way you can maintain. How are you going to produce more oil with notably less rigs? And the answer is efficiency gains continue. Once again, surprise to the upside. You saw longer laterals in terms of the drilling lengths. You saw, even more importantly, you saw faster turnarounds. These things were being used much, much quicker by more experienced teams. And you were just able to, once again, drill way more than expected and produce way more than expected. I think famous last words as we're entering the end of 2024 and going into 2025, it does finally, in fact, look like US shale growth is starting to slow. Again, I've cursed it by even saying this out loud, but relative to the 1.5 million barrels a day of growth last year, and kind of, in the middle of this year, next year, you're looking at kind of more like 500,000 barrels a day by most of the forecasters, which is slightly more attainable. But still, you're looking at this, 500, let's say even on the most conservative side, 500 from the United States, 550 from Canada, Guyana, and Brazil. You're already over 1 million barrels a day of non-OPEC supply growth at a time when global demand is wobbly, and OPEC is champing at the bit to return 2.2 million barrels to the market, which is a massive amount of crude to give back in a year. I think it's really hard for people to appreciate. That's a lot of oil. That's 50% more oil than even in the heydays of global oil demand that we typically grew in a year, which was kind of like 1.3 to 1.5. So this is a lot of oil.
And that sounds like a lot of potential supply, or actually a lot of supply currently and potential supply. One question I wanted to ask about the US was the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR. So obviously it's been depleted in recent years to help stabilize oil markets. Is it being refilled now? Is it, is it a factor that you look at for oil prices?
Yeah, so I've actually done, as I mentioned earlier, I actually come from a policy background. So I had a lot of fun with the SPR kind of as that policy was rolling out in 2022 with the Biden administration. The one thing I want to say at the top is I was a very, very strong supporter of the SPR release when it was initially done in early 2022. I think the challenge is that, because I think it's easy to forget as well because of how the market turned out. But in April of 2022, the IEA released a report that said we were going to lose 3 million barrels a day of Russian supply. This is before we had COVID zero in China. So no one thought that China was going to lock down again. They had actually arguably done better than everyone else up to that stage in COVID. So there was this massive expected hole in the market. And I think the SPR was only going to be a drop in the bucket of that kind of expected deficit. But under that kind of acute backwardation in the market, we were like $20 backwardated over a year or so. Like it was a crazy market in the first half of 2022. That was absolutely justified. I think if you say that that's not if that didn't justify an SPR release, literally no market justifies an SPR release. The challenge was that by the time, because bureaucracy moves slow, by the time they ended up getting the oil out the door, by far the peak of tightness had well passed us. They didn't get to peak release until that fall. And by that point, we were already falling. We were already back down below $100. So I think in the future, I think the hope is that the SPR can be more market reactive or at least market aware in its policies. But I do think a lot of the kind of political hate the Biden administration got for that release is entirely unwarranted, because I think people are saying it left the United States less secure. I think if you have to wait for literally the market to be at $500 a barrel to do anything, you've already failed. I think the US doesn't use its military by surrounding the White House in tanks and pointing outward. It has to engage with the market. It has to engage abroad in order to actually try and achieve its goals preemptively, proactively. I think that's the same philosophy as with the SPR. Now they have started refilling it. And I think the latest count is between kind of 40, 50 million barrels they've returned, far less than the 200 plus million barrels that they drained over the course of 2022 and forward. But I think the other important context there is that that was an exchange. They basically structured it as an exchange with Congress. That you had a bunch of these congressionally mandated sales of the SPR in order to essentially paper over budget gaps. It was Congress was treating the SPR as a piggy bank. Terrible policy. I was mentioning earlier that the Biden administration lacked market awareness by the end of its release, and I think that's still a fair criticism. But mandated sales over multiple forward years is the definition of market unaware. And I think that's the worst kind of policy to use the SPR with. But the challenge is that basically the SPR, or the Department of Energy's so-called petroleum fund, is now out of money. They basically have, I think, probably 5 to 10 million barrels that they can get more, and then they're out. Because most of the proceeds that were received from those sales at $90 plus, huge amounts of money, hundreds of billions of dollars, all was essentially remitted back to Congress in order to in exchange for the cancellation of those mandated sales. So now if a President Biden, or let's say a future President Trump, if Trump wins in November, if they want to refill the SPR further, they need to basically get additional funds from Congress to recapitalize the petroleum account. Otherwise, they have no money to do it with. And I think they need to do that now sooner than later, because by the time you actually would want to, let's say, for instance, that 2025 OPEC's deal collapses, we're at $20 or sub $20 a barrel crude. That's exactly the kind of moment where the SPR should be buying hand over fist. But if they have to fight with Congress to get funding to do so, we'll miss the opportunity. So I think they have to do it sooner than later so they can be aware to buy that on the downside when that opportunity arises.
Okay, no, that's great. Now, I just wanted to sort of talk about a few other factors for oil markets. One is China. You mentioned that Chinese demand for oil fell this year, which is incredibly rare. So what's your, do you have a perspective of why Chinese demand was so weak, and then perhaps an outlook on China?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things here. The first thing I have to say is that anyone that watches this market knows Chinese oil demand data is terrible. We have to infer, it's essentially a guessing game through shadows, essentially the amount of oil that has disappeared within the Chinese economy. Based on that, last year was a gargantuan year for Chinese oil demand. We had more than, depending on the numbers, my numbers showed upwards of 2 million barrels a day year over year of Chinese demand growth. That's the fastest you've ever seen of any country in the history of the market. At the time I said it actually seemed almost unrealistically strong. And I think that the concern at the time, and I published a piece on this called China Oil Demand Doubts, was that it's happening at another time that they were, The Economist published a piece about them stockpiling a bunch of copper and agricultural commodities as this potential precursor of heightened conflict with Taiwan. And I think under that same lens, it wasn't crude that was disappearing. It was refined products, which is, again, not something that you would traditionally see Beijing stockpile. You would see them stockpile crude, not diesel and gasoline. But it was diesel and gasoline that were theoretically, at least, getting stored. Otherwise, you had crazy strong demand growth, or just crazy strong demand. Now, I think it was never proven. So all we can do is kind of go off with what we saw. And what we saw was really, really strong demand in the second half of the year. And at the time I wrote, it's going to be really, really hard to meet this bar again in 2024. And that's exactly what we've seen. Basically, the year started out more or less fine. But as soon as you got into the period where the year-on-year comp started factoring in that explosive second half growth, you basically turned directly into contraction. I think Chinese demand by my numbers has been in contraction year over year since April. And basically by August was year over year kind of average contraction of just about 100,000 barrels a day, which again, the only other time that they've contracted on a year over year annual average basis was in 2022 with COVID zero. And before that, you didn't see that in over 30 years of data. So this is extremely, extremely rare. Just to put the kind of why it's such a big headline and why it's so disruptive to the market. China usually grows 500,000 to 1 million barrels a day of growth every year. That's what the oil market that I grew up in was, you were kind of raised to expect.
And I was going to ask, in terms of all this talk about China stimulus, how do you think about stimulus then in relation to oil demand? Because presumably some types of stimulus could lead to more oil demand and others may not.
Exactly. So I think there are two things driving current Chinese demand weakness primarily. One is the kind of weakness in the industrial side, specifically kind of anything linked to real estate, which has had a historic kind of collapse and pullback in China. So construction and real estate and infrastructure investment, et cetera. So I think that is why you've seen diesel as the kind of epicenter of weakness in China. So I think that checks out based on the kind of macro China story. But on top of that, and there was actually a really good piece I actually posted about just this morning from the FT about LNG displacement in heavy Chinese trucking. And I wrote about this back in the summer as well when it was an earlier story. But what we're seeing is, arguably, in addition to this kind of industrial weakness, you're seeing direct displacement of diesel use in things like heavy trucking, which has historically been viewed as this long-term safe haven for petroleum and diesel. Sure, we'll lose gasoline to EVs, but long-haul trucking, freight, that's really, really hard to displace. But they've been doing it through state investment into, LNG fueling, et cetera, et cetera. So I think when you look at the stimulus right now, I think the early stimulus kind of signs were that it was going to be heavily geared towards the equity markets. It was really trying to support financial markets and financial conditions. Some of the later announcements have been more fiscally tilted, but what we would really need to see is something like we saw in 2008, in 2016, where you had this massive explosion of Beijing-centered kind of stimulus and spending by the provinces and local authorities to kind of juice up the real estate market, juice construction. That would, I think, absolutely have a beneficial effect on oil and probably pull us back into positive territory. But that only helps that kind of macro side of it. It doesn't help that displacement side of it, because theoretically, that's only going to entrench itself further and further the longer this happens. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag, but I do think that people that are waiting for a massive bounce back in Chinese demand are probably going to be disappointed.
And if you put all of these factors together, we're going to come on to geopolitics and elections, but leaving those aside, it sounds like it's on a, say, let's say 3 to 6 months or 12-month basis, it's a bearish outlook on oil from everything you've sort of said. It seems like there's too much supply, Chinese demand is soggy at best. So overall, it's a bearish outlook.
It is an absolutely bearish fundamental outlook. I think the only thing that really complicates that kind of ubiquitous bearishness is that fundamentally still our balances, the balances that everyone's showing that show markets in notable surplus next year assume a full return of those OPEC plus barrels at 2.2 million. If we don't get that, then next year's market can still be in deficit, arguably. The challenge is that just every month we go by where we don't have those barrels return, it increases the probability of that ultimate bearish tail risk. So I think my balance next year, my gut feeling is that you're going to see Saudi Arabia and the rest of OPEC plus blink, probably coming up into this kind of December deadline. They've been really trying to message that they won't, but they did the same thing before October, and they did at the end of the day when push came to shove. If you don't have that return, the market next year is tighter, absolutely, but it just increases the risk that the UAE goes rogue, or Iraq goes back to cheating and Saudi wants to punish them, or something else happens within the kind of really complicated internal politics of OPEC that caused the thing to fall apart. And then we don't just get 2.2 million, we get 4.5 million barrels they dump back into the market immediately. And then we're like $50 would be a bullish price then. We're likely diving well below that.
And do you have a price target for next year?
I don't have an official price target, but my gut in terms of what I think that the Saudis will tolerate, the lowest would be a 65 Brent. I think if we go below that, I think that they're going to try and keep supporting the market. Now, the argument is that if the market gets ahead of itself that way, and if prices start falling, and then Saudi Arabia decides to try and step in and prevent it from falling, it may already be too late. I think if, once the market starts momentum and starts going down, then you also have the rest of OPEC looking at this like, wow, why are we holding all these barrels off market? If the price is collapsing and higher cost producers are taking all this market share, we're all opening the taps. And I think I kind of always go back to 1986 as the kind of real bearish scenario here, which is at one point through the summer of 1985, I think it was, that, and at the time, the North Sea was essentially the shale of the day, this new kind of non-OPEC source of supply growth. At one point, the British portion of the North Sea alone was producing more than the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis, I think rightfully so, are like, this is absurd. and they decided to open the taps. The king ordered basically to flood the market. And we essentially had a lost decade of oil prices from 86 to the mid 90s. And I think that is the ultimate risk here. And now, obviously, there's actually less oil proportionally off the market today than there was in the 80s. So I think it's not quite the same level of risk, but I think it's the most accurate kind of political comparison that we have. I think people will go back to, let's say, like, 2020 and like a market share war. I think that was happening in the context of a completely novel virus and kind of unknowns. Like, that was a temporary sharp shock. That wasn't a long strategic policy. I think 86 is, I think, the much more concerning parallel historically.
Okay, so now let's move on to politics and geopolitics. On the Middle East, obviously recently we've seen a spike in oil, which has come off as of the time we're recording this, as it seems like Israel may not attack Iranian oil infrastructure. But in general, why haven't Middle East tensions led to high oil prices? We've had Israel in conflict with a number of, countries, since October 7th, a year ago. And you would have thought, Middle East conflict, missiles being lobbed across different borders, oil prices should spike. Why hasn't it happened?
In a word, exhaustion. I would say that the last 5 years, and even the last 2 years, have been so completely bamboozling in terms of headline risk and geopolitics. Like, we can go back even to 2019 with the Iranian missile and drone attack against Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia. That was such a big risk prior to 2019 that I took part in like scenario planning exercises where that was actually the core of the scenario. Like, that was that was like the big risk. And basically prices had their largest ever, 1-day spike. But then that spike basically lasted like a month. And basically we got back to normal. Then you had COVID. Then you had Russia invading Ukraine. Then you had, the Houthis in closing shipping traffic through the Red Sea. Then you had, all these things. And then you had October 7th. Then you had Gaza. Then you had Hezbollah. Then you had Iran. All this stuff. And I think so far we haven't lost really a single drop of oil. And I think the markets just kind of said, you know what? We're a much more quantitative market now than we were back in, let's say, the early 2010s, where this would have completely caused things to go absolutely haywire. And all of our models say to sell every one of these geopolitical headlines because the price spikes, we sell. And that has been a reliable source of alpha, if you will, for these funds and market makers, for the last couple of years. That isn't to say that the risks are gone. I think everyone's still, and I think what you saw even with this latest kind of run up from the high 60s in Brent all the way up to kind of above 80 again, that's a big turnaround. And I think that what you saw with Israel in particular was that anytime Iran got more involved, people got concerned again. But if it was just Israel and the Palestinians in conflict, or just Israel and Hezbollah in conflict, that wasn't as much of a concern. It was always the question of, okay, is this enough to get Iran more directly involved? Is this enough that Iran gets involved?
On Iran, is the question there around Iranian oil production being affected because they're an important supplier to the market? Or is it that the market fears that Iran may then attack, say, Saudi facilities again, because Saudi is viewed as being allied to Israel? Or is it that Iran will close the Straits of Hormuz, which has been, people have talked about that for like decades, it seems.
Yeah, and I think it's all of it, and like the least satisfying way to answer. But I think like they kind of go out in order, right? I think the most likely kind of tail risk would be, let's say, Israel hitting Karg Island, right? You lose 1.1 to 1.4 million barrels of Iranian exports. That's tight for the market, but the market can honestly handle that. As I was saying, OPEC Plus is looking for a way to return 2.2 million barrels a day of production next year. Losing 1.4 million barrels a day of Iranian exports would be fantastic for the rest of kind of quota observing OPEC Plus. The worry, and I think why you've seen the Saudis in particular push back on Washington to say, like, don't do this. And if you do, please, please, please don't use our airspace. And that's kind of, there's been these like implicit threats between Tehran and Riyadh about like, don't do it again. Remember what happened in 2019? That was just kind of a taste. So I think that's the next level that you could see attacks on Saudi or Kuwaiti or Emirati assets. And And then finally, I think the mother of all kind of geopolitical risks, like you noted, for decades, longer than I've been alive, has been the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the loss of 25+% of global crude oil flows. Yeah, that in that case, if that happened for a durable period of time, then all of our rules go out the window. $200, $300 crude, completely plausible. But it's such an infinitesimally small tail risk that I really don't think the market even counts it anymore. China would basically send in its military to stop it at that stage. China is not typically that involved abroad in many ways, but it would absolutely do so if that kind of risk all of a sudden manifested, because China now buys a lot more of that crude flow than the United States does. So I think it's a risk, but I just don't think it's a realistic one.
It sounds like the biggest risk there is if somehow Iran attacks Saudi or Kuwait in some way. Now, back in 2019, why didn't that lead to a more durable spike in oil? I mean, why even back then when they attacked those facilities in Saudi, there was a spike and it didn't last very long.
Yeah, and I would say that the Saudis actually got the facility back up and running pretty quickly. I can't remember the exact, I need to check by. It was like 2 weeks, and they were basically pushing barrels back to the facility. And not at full capacity, but pretty close. And I think everyone was surprised how quickly it came back online. I remember taking part in like a conference call that Sunday, because it happened over a weekend. And it was like, oh my gosh, like how bad is this going to get? And basically the question on everyone's lips was, like how quickly can they repair it? And you were starting to get like mixed intel, satellite photos of like big holes in the sides of like, refining facilities. You're like, that seems like it's going to take a while to fix. But it didn't. And they actually were able to get through it pretty quickly. I think some of the crude ended up getting rerouted, and maybe some of it didn't get refined domestically and was exported instead. But the overall liquids balance impact on the market was much less than had been appreciated at the time. So I think that, I think when you take all like this list of like, okay, well, if Abqaiq gets hit, that's one of our biggest risks. Oh, well, if Russia invades Ukraine, one of our biggest risks. Like where we've literally gone down the list of like, the horror, the cast of horror characters from like, Friday the 13th for oil markets, and really nothing happened. And I think that's this kind of lesson that the current oil market has begun to learn. Like most modern oil traders, like a lot of people under 30 have never really seen a supply shock in their lives. I have barely seen a real supply shock in my life. I've just read about them historically as like a thing that used to be the biggest kind of source of concern for these markets. And I think it's similar to, I think you hear people kind of bemoan how, modern equity traders, like kind of broader macro traders, have never really seen a bear market in their lives. It's always buy the dip. And I think it's the opposite in oil. It's kind of like sell the spike. And it's hard to blame them because it's worked.
Yeah. Now, speaking of horrors, we have the US election coming up, and it's quite a vicious election. In terms of oil markets, I think the interesting one is Kamala doesn't seem to have any clear, oil policy, at least in relation to Biden. It seems like it's continuity. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But then Trump explicitly has talked about oil. And that's a central plank of his policy platform, that he thinks, he's claiming that there's a number of steps that a Trump administration could take to unlock a lot of US oil supply. So first, just on that specific point, what's your view? And then second, what's your view on the US election in general in relation to oil markets?
So my view on, I've always found it fascinating because people always want to talk, media always wants to talk about like, oh, what's the US election angle? And I've always had this like really unsatisfying answer that I just don't think the White House has much influence on US domestic oil production. I think you've seen some of the largest gains under Democratic administrations that are ostensibly hostile to Texas and hostile to Republican states and oil producing and everything else. But it doesn't really matter because the US is a free market economy with lots of diversity of kind of actors. It's not like there's a state oil company that's kind of receiving direct instruction. These are like atomistic actors that are all profit seeking, and they will bemoan the government. But I always find it funny, the idea, this implication that like, because Biden says he doesn't like oil, Texas drillers aren't going to drill. Give me a break. Like, if anything, it's going to make them want to drill harder, right? I think, just like watch me prove you wrong. And they have repeatedly, because now, both Biden and Kamala have talked about how like they've promoted the idea that U.S. oil production is surging, U.S. natural gas production is surging. And I think rightfully so. I think it's a good thing. And I think it's good to finally see Democrats stop being at least ashamed of that. But in terms of like this drill, baby, drill mantra, sure, there's like little bits they could do on the periphery. But I just don't see anything coming out of Washington that would fundamentally change the kind of structural course of U.S. shale production.
People talk about Alaska, things like places like that.
Yeah, I mean, like, sure, we could get little bits here and there, but Alaska's never, like, we're never going to have, like, the second coming of, like, Alaskan production boom, or, like, the most we're going to get would be half of a good year out of the Permian, you know? Like this is, like, it's, sure, like, little bits, but I think so insubstantial in the scheme of U.S. production that I don't see it as that worthwhile. That said, I think where you could see where the president does have outsized control is in foreign policy, and foreign policy and security policy does have a very acute effect on oil markets. I think the three most notable areas there are going to be sanctions policy on Russia, on Iran, and on Venezuela. I think all three countries are on various regimes of U.S. sanctions. If you wanted to see the U.S. produce more, sanctioning Iranian oil, which has surged under the Biden administration for a variety of reasons, but I think people rightfully point out that there's at least been some weaker enforcement of sanctions in the books for Iranian exports. If Trump came in and cranked those back up and Iranian production fell by 800,000 or 1 million barrels a day, yeah, that would support oil prices and that would support oil production in the United States. I think that, so you can see that. I think same with Venezuelan production. You could slap more sanctions on Maduro, I think reasonably justified at this stage, and that would reduce Venezuelan production and lift oil prices. But I think if you view it from the lens of like, I've some of the clips are like, oh, we're going to promote oil production, so then, you know, gasoline prices in the United States are going to plummet to like levels you've never seen before. And like that, no, because you need such low oil prices for that to happen that U.S. production would not be growing, it would be shrinking. So you still need $65, $70+ a barrel for U.S. shale to keep growing in any meaningful way, unless we have a complete change in the tenor of capital markets and capital markets decide, oh yeah, actually we're willing to give you another $500 billion like we gave you in the decade prior to COVID. And it would be great if you could just produce all the oil you could, make zero profit, and set all the money on fire. That could definitely juice production again, but I just don't see that as like a plausible way the market's going to react to this.
Yeah, I think investors have been scarred after that.
A little bit.
Okay, that's great. We've covered a lot of ground. That's been really good. I did want to round off with a couple of personal questions. One was, we do have younger people listening to this as well, and many of them are at university and soon to leave university. So what advice would you give people as they're leaving university and entering the real world?
So I'm thankfully able to give some of this advice frequently, because I also, in addition to Commodity Context, teach a course at the Munk School of Global Affairs, my old grad school at the University of Toronto. So I deal with a lot of students, and one of the things that I always come back to when I talk about advice, I think myself coming out of grad school, you're just so anxious for a job. You'll like take anything, but you're typically looking at two things. You're looking at institution that you're going to join and title, because those are fancy, and obviously salary, right? But I think the thing that I really stress to people is like, people like not what you want to be or what job title you want to have. Like, what do you want your day to look like? Do you want to be writing? Do you want to be talking to clients? Do you want to be on TV? Do you want to be executing deals? Do you want to, like, what do you really want to be doing? And I find that I'll often ask students this, and they just kind of like stare at me blankly, like, oh, I just assume I'll get an analyst job and then people will tell me what to do. But I think that's a little bit of like being like a price taker on life. I think you have this ability, particularly in grad school or undergrad, to kind of like, what do I want my day to look like? And I think a lot of people, most notably, I find when people are unhappy in a position, it's not because they don't like the position or whatever else, it's that they don't like what they're doing day to day. They're doing annoying reports, or they're dealing with annoying clients, or they're doing something that exhausts them, traveling too much or whatever else. I think that's what I really stress is like, what do you want your day-to-day schedule to look like? And then kind of work backwards. I love writing, research, and talking to smart people like yourself. I've hit the jackpot. I think this is fantastic. And I think I really encourage students to try and take that own kind of control over their own kind of day-to-day lives going forward.
That's fantastic advice. The other question I wanted to ask you, and I see you have a bunch of books behind you. What are some of the books that have influenced you, or perhaps recent books you've read that you would like to recommend?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch. I think obviously I mentioned at the beginning, Dan Yergin's The Prize. I think for anyone entering the industry, just getting that full top to bottom kind of early history is like a fundamental must. I think it just allows you to see things in a different light so thoroughly. I've also found books like Superforecasting, which is a fantastic book on shifting your mind away from thinking causally to thinking probabilistically, which I think particularly in this current market of geopolitical risk and everything else all the time is a really helpful frame. Because if you were only at 0 or 100% on every view, you would literally go insane in this market. So I think that was a nice kind of primer. But I think also books like, understanding the personalities that help drive this industry. I think The King of Oil about the life of Marc Rich, which, the founder of Marc Rich & Co., the predecessor of Trafigura and Glencore. And then also obviously through the same tack, I can't picture it's somewhere on the shelf right there, but also Javier Blas's and Jack Farchy's New: The World for Sale, which is the kind of newer version of a book like this one. They're fantastic. I think gives you a flavor for kind of like the swashbuckling skullduggery, if you will, that goes underneath the kind of surface of this industry that as like a desk analyst like myself is like really fascinating. I think always a good, important reminder that the data you're seeing is only a shadow of reality. And the final one I want to mention is I should have picked these books out before, but it's called Dead in the Water. It was one of the FT's books of the year, I want to say a year or two ago. But given the level to which shipping industries and tankers have come to play such an important role in the last couple of years through the Red Sea and through Russian sanctions, et cetera, understanding a bit of how the oil tanker market operates and how it's insured and how these things it almost makes some of the skullduggery of commodity markets seem tame. And I think that level of stuff, all adds just a level of texture to your appreciation for this market beyond the numbers and the charts.
That's fantastic. Now, finally, what's the best way for people to follow you and your work?
Yeah, so I'm available. I tweet way too much. Rory_Johnston at Twitter or X these days. And you can follow all of my work kind of in real time at commoditycontext.com. I would love to see you there.
Great. No, thanks a lot. That's been fantastic. We've covered a lot of ground and I really appreciate that. And good luck with all your fantastic work and keep it up.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.